Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second session of AFBI's Environmental Soil to Sea webinar series. In AFBI, one of our key themes is to enhance our natural and marine environment. AFBI is often aligned with the agri-food industry, but we also have a very strong body of environmental and marine scientists. With Northern Ireland being a small geographical region surrounded by the sea, the link between our land use and fisheries practices and the health of our freshwater, coastal and marine systems is key to the sustainable development of our economy. We need to optimise the management of agriculture and fisheries so as to protect our natural capital for future generations. In AFBI, we are uniquely positioned to address these challenges, right from the biogeochemical processes in the soil right out to sea. We have an extensive range of expertise and platforms that enable us to address these challenges from soil to sea. These platforms span instrumented landscapes at our farm in Hillsborough, high-resolution monitoring sites in a range of catchments across Northern Ireland, long-term monitoring of water quality and ecological data sets from rivers and lakes, and also monitoring stations at our coast. And also we have the research vessel Christie's, which gives us a capability to work across the Irish Sea right up to the North Atlantic shelf. Working on these platforms, we have expert scientists in the area of soil processes, catchment science, terrestrial and aquatic ecology, fisheries and water quality, to name just a few. The work of these scientists is being carried out to provide a better understanding and also to provide solutions to achieve sustainable development of the agri-food and marine sectors. The Soil to Sea series is about showcasing some of the excellent research that's being carried out on the environment in AFBI. Week one, we focused on nutrient management from farm to catchment scale, while this week we moved to research that focuses on the impact of the environment, nutrient loading, and the human pressures on life in our rivers and lakes. We have three excellent presentations for you this morning. And firstly, we have Dr. Robert Rosell, who's an expert in freshwater fisheries research, and he will provide an overview of how nutrient levels and other changes in fauna. And after that, we have Dr. Maria Snell, who will explore ecological studies from AFBI's long-term monitoring and the Colebrooke and Upper Bann. And then finally, we have Dr. Richard Kennedy, and Richard will talk about the Dollaghan trout from Lough Neagh. So with no further ado, before we move on, I just want to draw your attention actually to the questions and answer button at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, where you can post your questions. And if you post the questions, I'll ask them at the end of each presentation if there's time. And at the end of the three presentations, we'll hold a panel discussion with the three presenters, joined by Dr. Yvonne McIlerney, to answer more of your questions. So please do keep the questions coming, and that'll keep the conversation rolling. If we don't have time to answer your question this morning, we will come back to you after the webinar to give you an answer to your question. So once again, I just want to thank you all for attending this morning and hope you enjoy the presentations. And with no further ado, I'll hand over to Robert for his presentation. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Dollaghan. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this series of seminars on the aquatic environment. For those of you who were there last week, you will have seen how the soil and nutrient processes work in agriculture and how nutrients move through soils. And this week, we're moving downstream into the rivers and lakes and seeing what the impacts are there in the aquatic environment. This talk is a general introduction to eutrophication and enrichment of rivers and lakes, how it affects and what changes it brings about, and leads into the two talks which follow by Maria and Richard, which are in considerable more detail. And so first of all, what I'm going to take you through, I'm going to take you through where the nutrients come from, how they enter the river, and the impacts on biota. Then I'm going to move from rivers to lakes and look at how we classify lakes, how we decide what status they're in terms of on an enrichment scale. Then I'm going to move a little bit more detail and look at Lough Neagh and see how does our current fish population in Lough Neagh relate to the state of the environment, and how do we make sense of that. And finally, I'm going to look at some new data on from the 2018 heatwave on an event that happened in Lough Neagh, which gives us some pointers and warnings for the future. So look at rivers. We have everything from small mountain streams to lowland, deep-flowing rivers. Two pictures here to give examples. Everybody has their own view of what a river looks like. And they all receive nutrients. Phosphorus and nitrogen are the main drivers, and they come in from agricultural soils as diffuse loading and farm runoff point source loading. Also, point source loadings from human wastewater treatment, either collective wastewater works or septic tank effluents. And there are also atmospheric deposition and the effects of bank erosion directly on river banks. And the impacts are sometimes very obvious. And the two photographs here, one of water crowfoot swamping some spawning gravel on the River Bush in County Antrim, and one of a duckweed bloom on the Coil. And when that happens, you know that there's a plenty of nutrient runoff supplying the growth of those plants. And when those plants die back, they create a sort of organic, basically a compost, which drops down into the pores in the gravel, blocks up river gravels. Where that's severe, you get these pollution incidents, which people are familiar with. Thankfully, these are a lot rarer than they were 20, 30 years ago. But the effect is the same. It's just when it's diffuse, it's slower and a bit less obvious. The channel form makes a big difference to how a river responds to a nutrient load and to a sediment load. Many of our rivers have over-widened, deepened and uniform channels to speed up land drainage, and those channels tend to be slower flowing. They can retain nutrients, and because they don't flood onto land, silt and nutrients very often will remain in those channels until it just moves downstream and either drops out in a river, in a lower river or the lake or even the sea. But where you see natural channels, and we do still have some, and it's worth going to look at them to refresh our memory sometimes on what we did have and what we could have again. And they are, you see, shallow sloping riverbanks. The riverbed is higher in the landscape. It's got lots of structure. And where that happens and rivers are free to flood, a lot of the nutrients that enter can be lost back to the vegetated margins. A little cue for Maria's talk later. She'll be talking about invertebrates. And one of the prime ways of looking at the impacts on rivers is to look at the riverbed and see the invertebrates that are living there. And we have a range of species and types of insects, mollusks, crustaceans. And from the populations you find in the gravels, you can tell whether the degree of organic loading that's present. In Northern Ireland generally, and thanks to NIA for this slide, it's from their most recent report, which is on the internet. And you see that in Northern Ireland, of the order of just over 30% of our rivers are classified as high or good quality in 2015. Slight changes year on year. But another interesting feature is that the very high, the quality rivers are quite rare. And to put that in perspective, this is a photograph I took early in my career of a type collection of stoneflies at the Fisheries Research Laboratory at Coleraine. And it would be very, very difficult to repeat this photograph today because stoneflies, which are the most enrichment sensitive river insects, are now rare or absent in many lowland rivers. To take that on to impacts on river fish, the invertebrates are obviously food for fish, but there's more subtle effects. The sedimentation of organic rich matter, which is grown either in river or washed into the river, can block up the gravels, and the salmonid fish need that open gravel for putting their eggs in and porous water movement through it for the eggs to survive. And also the fish need some of the structural diversity for the different life stages, and the draining and straightening and removal of substrates from river channels significantly impacted that. Thankfully, and this is a cue for you'll hear some more about this from Richard, we know a lot more about putting back the habitat into these channels, and there are ways of fixing them and getting them back to somewhere where they should be. onto lakes. A picture of Lough Melvin on a sunny day on a survey several years back. And we classify lakes according to the nutrient load. Now, these are international scales, and the terms that we use, people sometimes wonder what they mean, are oligotrophic, mesotrophic, eutrophic, and hypereutrophic. And basically, this is a nutrient scale from nutrient poor through meso, moderate, middling, rich in richness, eutrophic, enriched, and hypereutrophic, highly enriched. And we've been monitoring Lough Neagh as AFBI or DARD science since the early 1970s. And the key driver for production in freshwater is generally considered to be phosphorus. This is a graph of phosphorus concentration in Lough Neagh, and it's a rising trend over time, and it is firmly in the hypereutrophic category. So it's in the most enriched state as far as phosphorus is concerned. And for nitrogen, a little bit more interesting in that it was rising to late 1990s and has been falling since. And this is a consequence of various control measures and changes in agriculture, largely, and also some changes in human inputs as well. But this is a declining trend, but again, even that, when you translate this into total nitrogen, it's firmly in the enriched eutrophic category. So where you look at North Temperate lakes and you look at fish, you see across the piece from the Americas across to Asia, and you compile the data, you'll see that there's a general trend of the impact of enrichment on river fishes and lake fishes, and you see the most nutrient poor waters have things like char, white fishes, pollen, trout, and the rich waters have cyprinid fish like carp, bream, roach, and dominant, and there are some which span the piece and simply adjust their productivity and life stage like eel across, and then we have perch in the middle. So generally we should be looking at the top end of this scale for Lough Neagh, but there are some peculiar factors in Ireland, and largely driven by the fact that 11,000 years or more ago we were frozen solid, and there were no freshwater fish. Certainly, if you look at the glaciology, that's what is implied. And so everything we have native has colonized from marine ancestors, and some of those fish have marine and migratory phases to this day. And they're the char, salmon, trout, eel, the whitefish, shad, and lampreys and sticklebacks, all of which are still salt tolerant today. And then we have another group, most probably added by people, medieval onwards, waves of introduction, and they are the pike and the perch and the cyprinid fish, which are present widespreadly, particularly in lowland lakes. But we have to be very careful in Northern Ireland because of the who put what where when effect, and we don't always have everything everywhere. And we still see invasions and population explosions where fish move from one site to another, and we have still got a bit of general instability. In Lough Neagh, we have a massive commercial fish resource, and people sometimes wonder about this in freshwater, but we're certainly in a GB and Ireland context, we are unusual in this respect, not so much kicking Europe. There are plenty of commercial fisheries in freshwater in the rest of Europe. 300 tons of eel, up to 300 tons, generally a bit less, of pollen per year. And the pollen have a protected designation of origin status for the market. So it's very unusual to have this Arctic relic, highly sensitive fish living in Lough Neagh. We are currently monitoring the fish stocks of Lough Neagh more and more intensively. We now have an annual stock assessment for DARA fisheries management plans, and we use the same data to supply a fish-based quality assessment for both Lough Neagh and Lough Erne. And this throws up a bit of a paradox, because we see that Lough Neagh is dominated largely by perch pollen, with additions of some more tolerant species and also some more sensitive species up to trout and salmon going through. And then we also have roach as well. So why, and when you feed this data into the scoring methods, you come out that the fish score the lake as of high quality in 2018, whereas all the other environmental parameters score it as poor, and it comes out as poor on the one out, all out principle. So why are the fish different? Well, it's a fairly simple answer. If you're in the middle of Lough Neagh, on most days of the year, you'll see the waves, it's wind driven, and it's all mediated by oxygen. So in other words, the high oxygen levels are mediating the impact of eutrophication simply by feeding it and stopping it becoming anoxic and stagnant. But, and here where we come to the data from 2018 summer heat wave, Lough Neagh looked like this for 5 or 6 weeks. And I'll try and explain how the data works. This is a transect left to right from Ballyrone to Doss Point through the deepest part of the lake, through the trench at the north end. And at the start of the heat wave from mid-June onwards, we had a lake surface temperature of 17, 18 degrees and bottom temperature around 16 degrees. And you see I've color-coded the depth bands by temperature. Just to give the basic graph, and then to repeat that graph 3 times as we went through the heat wave, and towards the end of the heat wave, you see that temperature rises from the top, forcing warm water downwards. And by the end of July, we had seen a 2 degrees 3 rise through the water column with a warm surface forming and the cooler water in the bottom disappearing. That's all about the temperature, but and then parallel, we were watching the oxygen concentration. And as the temperature rises, the oxygen concentration falls. And this happens in the reverse direction, from the lake bed upwards as the sediment exerts oxygen demand and biochemical processes start to get going. And you see the bed level oxygen dropped below 20% air saturation value. That's a proportion of what that particular water could carry if it was fully aerated. And the surface level shrinks to a sort of 8-meter band of fully oxygenated water on the surface. Throw into this mix our most sensitive fish species. It's known as the pollen, but its alternative name for the rest of the world is the Arctic cisco. It has a global distribution of Ireland, Alaska, and northern Russia. We're an outpost left over perhaps 100,000 years ago from interglacial and pre-glacial distributions of the fish, and ours colonized from the sea quite the latest batch after the last ice age. Throw that into the mix and you see start of the heat wave, fine, not a problem. We had nice cool water at the bottom, which it likes. It was within its tolerances, and that water was the band of oxygen from the top what overlapped the cool water at the bottom, and it had a zone which you could happily live in. Then go through the heat wave. As the water warms, the oxygen starts to strip. It becomes pressurized. It's living in a narrower and narrower band, being forced up from the bottom by low oxygen and down from the top by increasing temperature. And by the end, we were starting to get concerned because the top zone in which it could live, which was fully aerated, was around 10 meters deep. Most of the loch is around 10 meters deep on average, but that was almost too warm and getting over their tolerances. And this kind of data explains why pollen show summer stress and sometimes growth checks in summer in our lakes, and is perhaps something to watch for the future. The other thing that happens with these deoxygenation processes is that they can cause the sediments to go anoxic and release nutrients back up to the water. And this is something we're watching in other research, which is perhaps one for another day. So in response to this, we have been thinking, well, what do we do for the future? And we, very fortuitously this year, early in 2020, deployed our first continuous water quality monitor in Lough Neagh, transmitting continuous data. And when we were unable to sample during the first lockdown period this year, this was the only remaining active source of water quality from Lough Neagh, and it's certainly earned its keep during that period. And you see, and this is last week, there's a public site, you can go on, you can see what's going on. And this is data from last week of wind speed, temperature, and oxygen in the surface layers. We are looking to the future at maybe adding profiles and depth to this kind of data as we further invest. So, and for the future, we have climate change and temperature. This is obviously a short-term snapshot in terms of long-term climate change, but you see from the start of our data series to the mid-1990s, there's no trend in temperature. We always assumed that Lough Neagh was on average, like most Irish lakes, around 10 degrees. But then it started to rise, and since the late 1990s, there's been a steadily rising trend, and both summer and winter conditions, and we've had temperatures now 1.5 degrees higher than we had before. Now, when you add that to the impact of temperature on fish life and on oxygen, and in response to the lake's response to nutrient load, you have something which we have to think very seriously about. So finally, I would just like to thank the team behind me. This wasn't done by one person over a short period of time, done by a lot of people over a long period of time. And Yvonne, James, Kevin, and Derek have all contributed to the material that went into this talk. And to finally conclude, I said most Northern Ireland rivers are impacted by agricultural land use and drainage nutrient enrichment. That is obvious, we can see it. The impacts are interlinked, and the channelization of the channels makes the effects of enrichment worse and the channels less resilient. Downstream, the lakes that receive that nutrient load are also enriched, and Lough Neagh in particular is highly enriched. And what is keeping Lough Neagh alive currently is the oxygen supply from its shallow wind mixed aerated basin, and that has kept it in good order and good fish populations for the past 30, 40 years. But if we see a further climate change and increase in temperature, there are obvious risks to that state. And so finally, it just leaves me to thank you all for your interest and to hand the baton back to Dollaghan, and we'll take perhaps one or two questions before Maria takes over. Over to you, Dollaghan.
Thank you, Robert. Fascinating presentation. So, I just encourage people to use the question and answer box, and don't be shy. No question is a bad question. So, put your questions up, and we can ask questions later in the presentation as well. Just before we pass over to Maria, Robert, I just want to ask you a little bit more about the situation with the pollen in 2018. How long do you think the pollen would have survived under those conditions? Well, if it continued on, do you think they would have rebounded if it had a big impact? Are they resilient, or would it have wiped out the population?
They're not particularly resilient, and there have been fish kills through over temperature and lower water quality on a very small scale in the past. But Lough Neagh is a big place, and the surface layers are at 18 degrees are still just within their tolerances and aerated. But what happens is they simply stop feeding and stop growing, and this is where we get the growth checks from currently. We didn't lose anything through fish kills in 2018 heatwave. We were watching for them, but it must have been coming close, was our conclusion. And I think it was a sort of salutary warning for the future.
And I suppose just before Maria starts, that's the fear that that increasing temperature that you're seeing in the lake, and that could have a long-term impact on the pollen population there.
And it is already having an impact in terms of the winter temperatures are also affecting they like to spawn in cool conditions like salmonids do, and they spawn around Christmas time, and they recent mild winters have resulted in some fairly low cohorts coming through, which we then advise fisheries management to adjust the harvest of those appropriately. And that's another thing we're watching. So it's not just summer, it's also winter temperature.
Okay. So I see one question coming in there, Robert. So I'll ask this to you just before we move on. Sorry, Maria, I'm keeping you waiting here. Do we know what impact sand extraction might be having in the invertebrates?
Yes, well, sand extraction has been a major story in Lough Neagh, and obviously the Minister has recently approved the planning. There are a lot of work went in by people other than ourselves to look at the environmental impact statements, and sand extraction certainly has a visible impact on the bed structure. We have not yet seen any major water quality impacts, and we don't have any major data series which show one way or the other whether there's an impact on the invertebrates. So it's not a question I can really answer. Apologies.
No problem. Thank you, Robert. Maria, now sorry for keeping you waiting. We'll pass over to Maria Snell, who's going to talk about the long-term macroinvertebrate monitoring program that AFBI has been carrying out in the Upper Bann and Colebrooke catchments. Over to you, Maria.
Great, thank you very much, Donica, for the introduction. So before I begin, I'd just like to echo Robert's sentiment about long-term data sets, and this is really a collaborative effort over 30 years now at this stage, and I'd really like to acknowledge everybody's contribution to this data set, and particularly those that have been involved in the re-establishment of this data set since 2017 when I joined AFBI. So just to begin, I wanted to start with the idea of water quality and aquatic systems, because they're very interlinked. And when we're talking about this long-term data set of macroinvertebrates today, I'm really referring to the streams and the communities that are living in these streams that run through the landscape, primarily in agricultural land. And sometimes they can be rather unassuming, and we can kind of overlook them for those reaches further downstream. But these habitats are very important in our landscape. They drain the majority of agricultural land, and therefore they have a really important role in nutrient processing and what happens further downstream. So I've a particular affinity for these types of streams. The middle photograph is a picture that I took a few years ago when I was on fieldwork in one of these streams, and it was a beautiful sunny day. And as I approached the beck, you could see this gorgeous golden hue coming from the stream, and that was that diatom film that was growing there, and that was really taking wonderful colours in the sunlight. And you can see, when you start to hone in and look at these beds, you can see lovely colours, red algae, cyanobacteria, blue greens, etc. So they're really an abundant life source. And of course, you can also have your macroinvertebrate communities and your fish. But these habitats, they're very interconnected with the landscape, and they're very sensitive to anthropogenic changes. So particularly in agriculture, this would be phosphorus here in Northern Ireland, but other stressors such as sediment, and those stressors that are modulated by climate, such as flow, temperature, and those event-driven transfers that are becoming more and more commonplace now. So we've more storms coming through. So what happens in these incidents is sometimes that too much nutrients comes off the landscape, and then you can get what you can see here in this photograph in the corner. You can get this kind of plume of green algae, and it can kind of overshadow kind of the habitat, so peripheral growth, and it can be harmful for the inverts and for other communities present. So when we begin to look at these, we're really using biomonitoring to allow us to assess the state, and then to pick up these impacts that we might see, and then to look, most importantly, is how do we protect and bring these habitats back to good status, particularly reaching or achieving policy objectives and ecosystem services. So with this in mind, we have an established biomonitoring and research program here in AFBI. given the focus on streams in my research area, the key drivers that we're looking at is climate and land use change, and these lead to an array of pressures. So you would have your nitrogen, phosphorus, soil erosion, hydromorphology, etc. And this, leads to changes in state, and when we have a really well established monitoring platform, state of the art, looking at water and aquatic quality. But what I'm particularly interested in is looking at impact in these systems. So there can be different types of impact. So there can be these long sustained changes, say in nutrient resource through farming practices. And then there can be more short-term impacts, such as that, drought or that drying period that we had, that Robert mentioned in 2018 when we had that very dry summer. And these can lead to changes then in the biophysical template, in terms of the structure of the communities that are present, in the abundance and biodiversity, but also in terms of the function, so the processing of these nutrients and transformation. Now today I'm just going to focus on the structure, but function and functional bioassessment is something which we are looking at within our monitoring programs, and we have some really exciting pieces of research coming on board with that as well. So watch this space. So all of these things then can lead in, and it really affects the response of the system. Okay, and this is what we're picking up then in terms of ecosystem services that these streams provide, in terms of regulation, service provision, etc. And so this feeds into response, but then the response, how these systems respond, also feeds back into the impact and the biophysical template and how these are managed. So it's a very iterative process. So just to follow on then, the next, I just wanted to say that where we're carrying out the majority of our research. So we are primarily in my research team looking at the Upper Bann and Colebrooke catchments as our key kind of research areas. And for in the interest of time today, I'm just going to focus on the Upper Bann. So we are currently looking at 13 sites across the Upper Bann, so starting it there in the Moorings, and it flows down to Banbridge. So we're getting kind of a gradient in rainfall, in land use, and in geology. So really, really good sites to help us investigate some of these questions. And the reason why we wanted to look at the macroinvertebrates specifically today across these sites is that they are central to the food web. So within these streams, it's a very relatively simple trophic structure compared to what you might find downstream. So you have your macroinvertebrates, which graze on the algae. So you can see there that kind of algae bed, and you have your diatoms in there as well. So that's what that illustration is. And then the invertebrates graze on this, and then of course you have your fish as well. And macroinvertebrates have really had a very long history in the assessment of system quality, indicator of disturbance, and they're also widely used under the Water Framework Directive, which has been guiding a lot of our monitoring and policy targets in the last 20 years. And it has been used in AFBI since 1990, so it provides a really unique opportunity for us to begin to look at change over 30 years now. So there's some key questions that we wanted to, I suppose, explore today, given that context. And one is, can we detect long-term trends in the ecological community in macroinvertebrates with respect to nutrients? And is there a seasonal dependent impact as well that there are detection that we can find? And then we're just going to finish the presentation today by briefly having a look at how real-time high-resolution ecological data, so here I'm referring to the benthos, to that diatom community, can support our understanding of system state of impact and recovery. So I just wanted to start here with the long-term macroinvertebrate series. So this is the data here that we're running from 1990 to 2020. And I just wanted to bring your attention to the top graph first. So here we have our soluble reactive phosphorus in that green line, and then we have the blue line there is your total organic nitrogen. So we can see here from the left of the graph in the 90s we've quite high peaks of nutrients coming through that we're picking up here across our sites in the Upper Bann. But as we move through the 90s and kind of from 2009 onwards, we do see that level dropping with some spikes. So you can see this spike here around 2018. So that was your nitrogen signal here coming through, and we're attributing that to our really dry summer that we have had that year, and we're currently looking into that as well. So when we come then to look, so overall we can see that this falling in nutrient concentrations across the data set, and we wanted to have a look to see, okay, so what impact might this be having on our macroinvertebrate communities? And here we're looking at our invertebrate communities in terms of the Biological Monitoring Working Party score. So you may be familiar with this, but what it does is it looks at the families that are present in that stream, and it gives them a sensitivity score based on their sensitivity to organic pollution. And if you have a score of 0, that's not so good, it's very poor condition, and anything over 100 is quite good. So just to help guide us through this, I've just put in a few notes for you on the level of impact. So we can see here in the 1990s that we had quite a high score for our communities across the Upper Bann. So we've had over 100, so pretty unimpacted. But then things began to deteriorate, and into 1993 we see that we fall down into a moderately impacted site. There was some recovery as we moved through the 90s, but then it kind of plateaued from 1995 onwards, and we have this moderately impacted state right across, even in our latest data set here for 2018-2019. So this leads us to ask why this might be. So we do see this fall in nutrients, and that can be attributed to many factors. So you have a look at the land management interventions. You would have had the capital grants in the early 90s, which allowed clean up of a lot of farmyards and those point sources. And then you have your use a lot of legislation around silage and different silage practices, the wilting, and that was generally taken on board. And we see this result in the nutrients. And then more recently, from 2000 onwards, we had the Water Framework Directive, and we have, the Nitrates Action Programme. We have your phosphorus regulations. You have change in farm practices through the CAP programme in 2004. So you can see all these different things that are coming on board that are having an impact, but we're not necessarily seeing that recovery in the community at a first glance. And when we think about this, we really need to come back and look that it's not that it mightn't be working, but we need to think about from an ecological perspective that, we need to look at life histories, and we need to look at these secondary stresses such as sediment and habitat, and the recolonization ability of these communities, that perhaps we need a certain threshold or a certain length of time for this to happen. So these long-term data sets are really helpful to begin to explore and tease apart some of these questions. So in terms of season, we had a look at our data set and looked at season and the role of season may have in our data set, particularly in terms of when we wanted to go out and we want to assess the success of different mitigation measures for pollution. We want to see, okay, so if we have this sustained impact over time, is the community kind of more or less the same status the whole year around, or can we detect differences across season, and does it matter when we sample? So with these questions in mind, we had a look at the average score per taxon. So you can see here the ASPT score. So this is your BMWP divided by the number of families that we had present. And we have an average here across season for 1990 to 1998. And then again, we have an average cross season here for our most recent data series from 2018 to 2019. And then here we have our soluble reactive phosphorus. So we have from 1990 to 1998, and again across season. And I don't want to get caught up in the absolute figures, but just look at the relative trends. So what we see is that we have a higher ASPT score in spring compared to summer on autumn, and this is reflected across the 2 time steps. When we looked at 1990 to 1998, we had this kind of moderately impacted, and it did increase to kind of good status with just dipping over 5. So you have this boundary of 4.8 that it kind of tips from eutrophic indication to better water quality, better habitat status. So we do see that in the spring. We don't see the same difference in summer and autumn in the communities. And when we look at the phosphorus, we see that soluble reactive phosphorus is lower in spring across both time steps, and then it does increase in summer and then plateaus out again in autumn. So just, I suppose, just to highlight here, the key message is, season is important, and we do need to think about when we're monitoring communities and how that previous season might have an effect on what we're seeing in the following one. And these kind of questions become particularly important when we think about future challenges of climate. So when we look back, it can help inform what we might see in the future. And this is a graph that Dr. Rachel Cassidy showed us last week, and it is very relevant for what's happening in the streams as well. So it's the total annual river discharge for sites across monitoring catchments, so you have the Upper Bann there as well, and we can see that overall there's this increasing trend for river discharge. And this is important in terms of season, because what the predictions right across the UK are for wetter winters and drier summers. So we're really, I suppose, seeing this acute changes in season, and what that might mean then for the ecology of our streams is quite important that we begin to consider that in our monitoring and in our projections forward. And this is some data just to highlight just how important season is, particularly under these projections of climate and how climate might change and how the intensity of our season might change. So this is data that I worked on when I was as part of the Eden Demonstration Test Catchment Project, and it looked at 3 different catchments in North East England, so very similar catchments to what we kind of see here in Northern Ireland, so learnings that we can transfer to our sites. And I'll just take you through the graph. So that top graph is hourly rainfall from 2011 to 2016. And you can see then the brown line is your discharge, again hourly, and then you have your total reactive phosphorus, again hourly. And even if you just look at this, eyeballing it, you can see those times of higher rainfall in autumn and winter, you have higher discharge in your streams, and then you also have that transfer of phosphorus into the stream. So really seasonal driven transfers here. And then if we come down and look at what's happening in terms of the community, so this bottom graph is your ecological quality ratio. So it's the metric under the Water Framework Directive. And this data relates to diatoms, so it's part of that phytobenthos, another key organism monitored under the Water Framework Directive. And these have shorter life histories than macroinvertebrates, so it can tell us a little bit more about the dynamics of the community over a shorter time snap. So this is over 6 successive seasonal cycles, and it's based on monthly monitoring of that community. And what we see here when we model this through arbitrary derived dynamic harmonic regression, we found that this explained 88% of the variation in the data. So a really strong seasonal signal coming through, despite the role of discharge and phosphorus in driving these more locally. We have this strong influence of climate, of season. And so this just begins to allow us to think about, future. So future monitoring. So when you look at that macroinvertebrate data series, there might be that apparent resistance to phosphorus mitigation measures, but we really need to think consider climate in this and the full range of ecological impacts, so that we can really understand what's happening and pick apart that apparent resistance. That sometimes we're monitoring success under short term, but really we need to consider longer time series to see that recovery in the community and to have set realistic expectations. So to help us, I suppose, pick some of these questions and what's happening at a more local scale, we have a high-resolution monitoring platform which has been established in the Upper Bann. So we have state-of-the-art monitoring of the water quality and quantity, which is a really fantastic resource for us ecologists when we come to begin to understand what's happening in terms of the community in stream. So on the back of this platform, I've been doing a number of different investigations and transferring the learnings that I've had from my previous research within the demonstration test catchment programme. And we've set up a number of high resolution monitoring of the ecology. So you can see here, Faye, one of our team, is looking at the chlorophyll A content here using the Bento torch, which allows for rapid assessment at the bank side of, which is really helpful for building up a picture of what's happening on that bed. We've looked at the sediment, we've looked at the role of different measures such as fencing, as well as it's coming on board. So we're looking at a lot of different things, and this has just been established in the last 2 years. So our data is just coming on board, and we're very excited for what we're going to see and for the questions that may help us answer, but also for what it might raise. So just to give you an idea of what we're seeing so far in this story, so this is data that's looking at the benthos. So we have here our bento torch, and we have our cobbles, which we are looking at the diatom community that's living on these cobbles, and this is what they look like under the microscope. So beautiful ornate cells, and then we have our bankside monitoring as well, as part of that high resolution monitoring platform. So just to take you through this graph, so we have our soluble reactive phosphorus is in green here, we have our discharge in blue, and then we also have our diatom community, which is measured in terms of the trophic diatom index. So that is a metric which shows sensitivity of the community to phosphorus. And then we have our bento torch readings of that growth on the bed, the chlorophyll A, that benthic biomass, and that is here in that dotted line. So it's really useful to help us understand what's happening. So I'll just pick out one section here of the data. So you can see here we have the tracking of the chlorophyll A, and we have this high discharge event here, which scours out that bed, so kind of takes away that biomass, and we see a drop in the chlorophyll A as a result. Here we had, before this event, we had quite low TDI score, so the lower the better in terms of trophic diatom index. But then after this event, you see the input of phosphorus, and we see a response in terms of the diatom community here in May. We have higher trophic diatom index score, which is suggesting more impaired conditions. And then, with this pulse of phosphorus, not only do we see a response in the terms of the diatom community, but we also have a response in terms of chlorophyll A. So that'll just give you the sensitivity of these streams and the dynamic. So we really have to consider this dynamic baseline when we're considering how we might monitor these catchments, and also for pollution mitigation as well. So just to finish, just some concluding thoughts so far. These long-term data sets are really invaluable for the insights that they give, across sites and catchments and within catchments. And when we look at the ideas around biological recovery, we need to consider that perhaps, that recovery might not be immediate, that we might need to pass certain thresholds in water quality, but also we need to think about the ecological perspective, so the ability of communities to recolonize, for example. And therefore, we need to really begin to think about both short and long-term strategies to promote the recovery of these, that it's not just a one-fits-all, and that we need to mitigate for the confounding effects of climate, and what that might mean for season and for life histories and for the resilience of our communities, and how, as we now begin to get a handle on phosphorus and looking at that stressor, that we can also start to bring in secondary stressors, which may come more to the fore as we begin to, I suppose, mitigate for phosphorus better in the environment. So I'm going to leave it there. I just want to thank you for your attention, and I will pass back to Donica if we have time for any questions. I'm happy to take some now.
Okay, Maria, thank you for that presentation. Very interesting. I just wanted to start out just thinking about, do you think the seasonal patterns that you're seeing are dependent on land use intensity within the catchments?
Yeah, a really good question. So what I've found from the research is that this seasonal signal is actually very powerful. So even across from uplands that are very lowly impacted to those that have quite high intensity farm use, so say poultry, dairy, we still see a really strong seasonal signal. So it is really important to consider right on all different land use types.
Okay, and just before I pass over to Richard and for his presentation, just ask you one final question. I suppose there's been work done in AFBI in recent times in relation to in-stream sediment and the sources of sediment. Do you think the in-stream sediment addition is it a source of nutrients, and is it bringing in additional stresses to streams in Northern Ireland?
So that's a really good question. So we've just been finishing up some research that we've been doing on that, looking at the role of not only the sediment but also the banks. So our results are just coming through on that. But the literature would suggest that these beds can be a source and a sink. So and that can change seasonally, and it will depend on different conditions on the bed as well, and where you are in the catchment. So I suppose my answer would be to watch this space, and perhaps if we've another one of these webinar series in the future, that we could maybe address some of these questions around sediment then.
Great, thank you, Maria. So now we're going to move over to Richard Kennedy, and Richard's going to tell a fascinating story about the Dollaghan trout in Lough Neagh. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Donica. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I want to focus now on a very iconic fish species in Northern Ireland, the Dollaghan trout of Lough Neagh, which travels the rivers and the lake system itself. First up, some background on the species. Brown trout are very diverse. They have huge adaptability. They are a fish species that is found virtually everywhere. We find them in small upland streams, we find them in rivers, in lakes, estuaries, and even out into the coastal zones of the UK and Ireland. The natural range of trout, brown trout, extends mostly around Northern Europe, but we also have seen them introduced extensively throughout the world, and there are populations of these fish that are thriving as far afield as Australia and South America. You see, this picture shows a number of brown trout from different stocks throughout Northern Ireland. You'll see in the top, the large photograph is a male lake run trout from Lough Neagh. You'll see beside it, you have a silver-coloured trout sampled from Strangford Lough, a sea-run fish. You can see on the bottom in the net, that's a Dollaghan captured up in the Kelswater River near Ballymena. So hugely variable, and because they are so variable and they have such ability to adapt, they are tremendously successful fish. We're going to think about Dollaghan and Lough Neagh. Dollaghan are what we call in the business a potamodromous fish. That is, that they have a migratory habit, but that habit is evident within fresh water. So most of the young Dollaghan that are produced around Lough Neagh are produced in upstream river areas. They grow there for maybe a year or two before they decide to emigrate downstream into the lough. They use the lough a bit like an Atlantic salmon would use the sea to mature, to grow. And once they're big enough, they then return to their natal river to spawn and complete the life cycle. So brown trout are probably one of the best indicator species for water quality that you could find. They do not tolerate poor water quality. They need a high oxygen content. They don't like a lot of the pollutants that are commonly encountered in fresh water. Because of this, and also because they are so widely distributed between rivers and lakes, and because of their mid to high trophic status, they're predatory fish that inhabit a higher status on the food chain. They are potentially very useful indicators for overall ecosystem health. So first of all, we're going to have a look at river habitats around Lough Neagh and think about juvenile Dollaghan trout in their natal streams. Now, we spend a lot of time in AFBI quantifying the resources of fish, both in rivers, but also our marine colleagues out at sea. And we need to understand how the stocks are performing. We need to understand how many fish is enough. And we use a number of data sets to do that. In freshwater, when we're thinking about juvenile fish, our principal method would be electrofishing. Electrofishing allows us to stun young fish in an area of habitat. We can collect those fish up, measure them, and return them back to the river. It gives us a degree of data on juvenile abundance. But we'll also use other metrics as and when we find them. Some angling clubs around the catchment will collect rod catch statistics. Those are very useful. But no matter what metrics we use or collect, trout are difficult things to assess because they inhabit different habitats over their life cycle, and because they are so diverse, it's hard to pin them down. Perhaps the most extensive data set that we gather each year is our semi-quantitative electrofishing data set. Semi-quantitative electrofishing is a quick 5-minute sampling protocol. You go in with a backpack and a catcher, and you sample habitat for 5 minutes and collect the fish that are stunned. You do this over lots of sites across your catchment, and that gives you a relative index of abundance for that river catchment in that given year. And it's a useful method because it's consistent, because the sites, usually the operators, the methods, the equipment is consistent. We can compare year upon year. This gives us a good idea about trends. It doesn't give us absolute numbers, but it gives us a really good insight into trends in individual river catchments. And if you look at these data that have been displayed here, you can see 3 of the main river catchments around Lough Neagh, 3 really important Dollaghan producing rivers. You'll see the Blackwater, the Main, and the 6 Mile Water, all characterised by fairly extreme variation in the recruitment year upon year. But the interesting thing about these three systems is that when you compare them, correlate them against each other, there is a fairly good positive relationship between the individual rivers, which does sort of indicate that there may be similar pressures driving recruitment at a larger Lough Neagh catchment scale. The electrofishing data can be used for other things as well. We've worked in the past with Queen's University in Belfast. We've sampled fish at each and every electrofishing site that we visited. That's allowed the geneticists there to look at the genetic structure of the Dollaghan resource in Lough Neagh, and it's quite unique. The rivers themselves have quite unique strains of Dollaghan, which are distinct one from the other. So we can get an idea about trend in young trout numbers, but one of the important questions that we have is how many trout actually should be there. Semi-quantitative data gives us a good idea of trend in juvenile trout abundance, but we've developed a useful tool called the Trout Habitat Suitability Score, or THS for short, which provides a reference point for how many trout you would expect to find in a given area of habitat or a site on the river. So any river section, the habitat quality for young trout is determined by a number of factors. What you find in the river bank is really important. It's nearly as important as what you find in the river itself. The young fish need shelter. They need insects dripping down in, and the vegetation we find in the riparian zone is really important to that. The width of the channel is important, too wide, and the channel tends to favour Atlantic salmon. Flow, they need adequate flow, not too much, not too little. The substratum is important. Trout are terribly territorial animals. They don't tolerate each other very well. And to fit more fish into a unit of habitat, if you have more cobble, boulders, rocks, structure on the riverbed. It allows the fish to visually isolate one from the other, and you can fit more in. And depth is important too. So all these factors are important in controlling how many fish should be in an area of habitat. And we can score each of these abiotic factors. We give it a score between 0 for very poor and 2 for really quite good. And if we summate these 5 factors together, that allows us to come up with a trout habitat score of between 0 for poor or 10 for really quite good habitat. And we can do this for any site that we care to go and look at. The next thing to do once we have established a THS score is actually to go into a river and to sample the fish that we find at that particular site. Now, this type of sampling is more involved in the semi-quantitative electrofishing. We have to put in stop nets at the top and bottom of each stretch, and then we fish that portion of the river to depletion. And when we've done this across numerous sites across Lough Neagh and Northern Ireland and compared the THS score against the density, the absolute density of young trout that we find there, we find that we can develop quite a nice model, a model that tells us effectively how many trout should be in any given THS score. So this is the background, the framework, if you like, for a reference system that allows us to estimate numbers and gives us a reference to compare numbers against. And we've been working with colleagues in ICES to look and see how robust this actually is. And we're working on an analysis now which shows that the THS score actually explains much of the variability in young trout abundance, particularly in coastal sea trout streams. Now, the ability to have a THS score then gives us an ability to look at the habitat against a particular target, and we can see whether the river is above or beneath this target and score the habitat. And we've been doing this for a number of tributaries around Lough Neagh over a number of years now, and you can see generally that recruitment is actually above target and doing quite well in most of our river systems. And if you're interested, you can go onto the website, onto DAERA's website, and look at the Digest of Fishery Statistics, which is published each year and contains a lot of this information. So that was a whistle-stop tour looking at Dollaghan in rivers. We want to think about Dollaghan in Lough Neagh now in their lake habitat. Unfortunately, the thing that sticks out here is that we know very little. We have a lot of unanswered questions about Dollaghan in Lough Neagh. For example, when do the young Dollaghan migrate downstream into the lake? Why do some go and why do some stay in their natal rivers? What habitats do the fish use in the lake? What's the relationship between lake run spawners and juvenile production in the rivers? Lots of questions, and we've been trying to address some of these questions using modern telemetry techniques. We've been engaged in a telemetry project over the last few years in Lough Neagh, and this basically has involved implanting acoustic tags, small transmitting tags, into samples of trout. The tags are surgically implanted, so the fish has the tag for life. If that tag is then detected on a receiver planted out in the lake or in a river, we gain data from that particular fish, and we can answer questions about movement patterns, survival, behaviour, timing of migration, and so forth. Really powerful data that we can generate. And we've been tagging fish across a couple of target catchments in Lough Neagh, the Ballinderry, and also the 6 Mile Water. And you can see some of the receivers we've set out. Just to give you a little tidbit from this work, this is the sort of data that we can generate. This is the detection log from a 20 centimetre trout par, a 1-year-old young fish that was tagged in the 6 Mile Water in late summer 2018. We expected that these fish would migrate downstream into the lake in the spring, and they would hang around their river mouth. In reality, we found they didn't do either of these things. This particular fish ran in the autumn. It moved extensively throughout Lough Neagh. It was detected all over the place, moved considerable distances, around the loch, used all sorts of habitats, and then returned back to its natal river the following year in the summertime, presumably to spawn. So we're unlocking some really quite interesting patterns. One of the perhaps major things that we've come across is that we fully expected young trout to go to the lake in the spring. This hasn't happened, and that paradigm of spring migration, I think, is rapidly being lost for trout. 90% of our tagged fish ran to the lake in the autumn time, and this brings up actually quite significant and profound questions, because much of the legislation that we have in place in Northern Ireland to look at predators and predator control on rivers, or to look at water abstraction and screening of abstraction sites, is based around a spring migration of juvenile salmonids. This may not be the case, particularly for trout, and we will be watching this very carefully as the research progresses. So Lough Neagh trout experience lots of pressures, too many for me to go into. Just time to mention maybe one or two of them. Habitat issues are problematic. Connectivity issues, climate change has been picked up on by other colleagues. All these things are problematic for trout. Perhaps the one that I want to just focus for a couple of slides on now is habitat loss. Many of the rivers around Lough Neagh have been drained and been subject to arterial drainage to prevent flooding and to improve agricultural land. But in many circumstances, this has been to the detriment of the salmonid habitat, and you can see some examples of drained, channelized rivers in this particular slide. Now, this is a picture I took in the headwaters of the River Blackwater, an important Dollaghan stream, and this was taken in 2003. And you can see this river section's pretty well impoverished. The banks are falling apart. They've been poached by livestock. Lots of silt have been mobilised. The river bed is carpeted with silt. So much so that the fish actually were finding it really difficult to spawn in the silty gravels. Now, a real horror story in terms of fishery habitat. But the local angling club were involved in an enhancement scheme in this particular river stretch, and this was a very simple, straightforward exercise. They did one thing, and that one thing they did was put up a fence. That fence was put up far enough away from the riverbank to keep the animals away and to allow the riverbank and the riparian zone to regenerate. And if we look now, a decade post that work, you can see that the channel form has completely changed. The banks have regenerated, the fence has done its job, it's kept the livestock away, and the river bed itself has started to clean up. The silt has washed out, and the fish are now spawning in this stream in good numbers. And we've been monitoring this particular stream over a long period of time, and you can see the electrofishing data shows that the numbers of juvenile trout, of naught-plus trout, have actually quadrupled in 10 years after the onset of these works. So the good news is we can do something, but we have to be on the lookout. We have to be on the watch out. We have invasive species on the march. With zebra mussels in Lough Neagh. They're in Lough Neagh as well. We have to keep an eye on these things. And just to conclude, I think it's important that we continue our fundamental research into migratory stocks of fish in Lough Neagh and Lough Neagh. I think these data sets are certainly informing fishery management, and as we go forward, hopefully we'll be integrated into some of the upcoming fishery management plans. And I think it's important that we continue along the track of much of this research, looking at how extensive autumn power migration is in other stocks and maybe in coastal areas as well, and looking at the relationship between adult spawners and juvenile populations in the natal streams. So that was a whistle-stop tour around some of our research into Dollaghan. I hope you enjoyed it, and I would be very delighted to answer any questions.
Thank you, Richard. That was excellent, fascinating story. So just one quick question to start with. How far away was that fencing from the stream? Because that's kind of important implications what you're presenting there for the ESF scheme, the Environmental Farming Scheme for farmers.
Yeah, that's true. In that particular example, I think the fencing was put over a metre back from the river edge, and that was sufficient to allow the vegetation to get a decent foothold. The fencing was also of a quality that really kept the livestock off the bank, and they couldn't reach over and graze down the vegetation readily. So it did its job in that particular context. I guess one of the challenges is getting the trade-off between getting enough ground and getting the fence up.
Thank you. And just before we move on to the panel discussion, just a couple of questions around the seasonal, the autumn migration of the parr. How extensive is that in other trout rivers across Northern Ireland?
Yeah.
Across Lough Neagh particularly?
Yeah, well, we've seen it in Lough Neagh. We've seen it in two stocks that we've tagged fish in Lough Neagh. We're engaged in a project in Lough Erne as well. It's early days on that particular project, but it does seem to be evident there. We are keen to look at it in the coastal region as well, and see whether young sea trout have the same habit. It is really important for us to understand this going forward.
And the pattern, that's fascinating, the 20 centimetre parr moving that distance across Lough Neagh. The pattern of that movement, is it completely random, or are they following feeding patterns, temperature, or some other thing within Lough Neagh? Is there some pattern to that?
Well, that's $1 million question, Dollaghan, and I think that's going to be a real focus of our analysis over the next year or two. We think that there may well be some seasonal movement patterns that fish are actually sharing, and it's not random. And that hopefully will be something that we can report on in the future. But yes, that's something that we're on top of, and we're doing a lot of work to understand.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. So I'll just invite all the panelists just to put their microphone and their video back on again, and we just have a few questions. Maybe we could consider 10 or 15 minutes. Robert, I'll start by going back to your presentation and the 2018 drought period, and also the increasing temperature in Lough Neagh. A question came in there that has this been demonstrated in fish scale data in some of your analysis? Also, was there any evidence around the impact of that 2018 deoxygenation of the bed sediment on the impact of macroinvertebrates? So there's two things there: the fish scales and the macroinvertebrate impacts.
Okay, I'll take the fish scales is relatively easy. We do have scales from pollen and all the other fish from our autumn monitoring, which is done in October every year, going back, and we have fish. We haven't yet gone through and looked for the summer check phenomenon in the 2018 batch, but the summer check phenomenon is quite well known in Lough Neagh pollen going back research 20-30 years. So I would be quite almost expecting to see it in the 2018 2-year-olds in the lake, once the scale is big enough to read. It used to be that pollen were really difficult to age until somebody discovered that what we were thinking were winter bands were actually these summer checks. So we're getting double the age we anticipated, and particularly in the Lough Neagh fish. So we look at a batch every year, we age a batch every year. We haven't yet got the data through. On the invertebrate side, and so the question came up again earlier, like I said, we don't have a long-term data set on the benthic invertebrates of Lough Neagh. And so I really can't answer the question. There are patchy data sets in possession of the various universities. University also have some old data on chironomids over time, and it could be possible to maybe access some of that and look for trends, but it is patchy over time and is more difficult to use. So it's not a question we have a clean answer to, so, as I said before.
Yes, sorry, I asked you that question twice, so I apologise for that. Richard, just to bring you on the Dollaghan trout side of it, that 2018 heatwave, did you see any impacts on the Dollaghan trout in terms of their movements in the rivers and lakes?
Funny, we have been discussing that recently, and 2018 there was some anecdotal evidence that the fish ran from the lake into the feeder streams slightly earlier that year, as a consequence perhaps of high water temperature in the lake. I suppose Dollaghan trout do have an advantage over some of the other fish species in that they have a potential migratory habit, so they can get out of the lake if the environmental characteristics annoy them or don't suit them. We certainly have seen that with Atlantic salmon in Lough Neagh, and in 2018 we had some tagged Atlantic salmon, which we tagged in a lower ban. We saw that those fish entered Lough Neagh and they did not hang about. Some of those fish exited the lake in less than 12 hours. They really didn't like the warm temperature, ran really quickly through the lake, and they got in. Some of them actually went into the first tributary that they could find. And interestingly enough, we had, I think, 2 fish that year. We had temperature monitoring tags in, and we could see the impact, because when the fish were in Lough Neagh, they were experiencing water temperatures of maybe 16, 17 degrees. And when they got into the river, that declined. So yes, I think trout and salmon do have an advantage over the other fish in that they can get out.
Okay. Yvonne, I might just bring you in here on the long-term changes in temperature. Wider implications of temperature increase in the entire water column of Lough Neagh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question, Donica. Temperature is such a major controlling variable in lakes, and Robert touched on some of the physiological impacts on cold water species like pollen. But additionally, temperature can also impact seasonal cycles, important seasonal cycles in lakes, like the emergence of zooplankton, and then this in turn impacts fish spawning and survival. And then temperature can also impact the survival of groups of fish that like warmer water, like the likes of eels and things like that. And in addition to biological impacts, we also have impacts on physical and chemical characteristics of lakes, and temperature influences sediment dynamics, and the sediments carry out a range of services in lakes that we don't really know about. They're kind of underrated. But one of the things that sediments do is they store nutrients and other metals. And temperature is one of the factors that influences whether these are contained within the sediments or released. And we know that we see a pulse of bioavailable P being released every summer in Lough Neagh, and through one of our research projects that we're looking at, sponsored by DERA, we're looking at the characteristics of this P and trying to figure out how long it might take for this P to be flushed out of the lake. So this release of P can be affected by temperature and other factors as well, and this can undermine management measures in the catchment at times.
Okay, thank you, Yvonne. Maria, there's a question here in relation to can you back calculate reconvert back from the BWMP back to the ASPT scores and look at long-term trends? Is that?
Yeah, that's probably in relation to the WHPT, I imagine, and the WFD metrics. So, so this is something that we have looked at. Unfortunately, there were some constraints in the data set when we went right back to the start. That we're currently working through, but we will have that available for the more recent data sets, because EQR is really good and it puts a good context and it takes into account different parameters such as alkalinity and altitude. But unfortunately, at the moment, we're just not able to backtrack with that earlier data, because this data was part of a larger data set that was looking at over 50 headwater streams across the catchments. So their objectives was spatial, and their methods were slightly different. So they were looking at just the presence and absence. So yeah, that's why we've gone the route we have with this long-term trend.
And in relation to the increasing discharge that you showed in your presentation, has your data shown any impacts of that increasing discharge, or if not, what impact do you think it would have over a longer period?
Yeah, I think the discharge and what's happening in terms of those kind of factors that are modulated by climate, such as flow and these event-driven transfers, this is really important just in terms of when we look forward, that we need to remember that when we're assessing our ecosystems, it's against a very dynamic background, and that becomes very important for land use practices as well, that we need to consider that these things are not static, they're very dynamic baseline, and we need to consider that.
Okay, thank you. So Maria, this is a common trend, and I suppose linking yours and Robert's presentation. Both of you mentioned the long-term monitoring, the real-time monitoring that might be going on in your habitat relation to the long-term, real-time monitoring of ecology. And Robert, you mentioned the real-time monitoring in Lough Neagh. What do you see? What Maria, to start with you, what do you think the future of that is? Do you think that can be incorporated within our long-term monitoring at national level?
I think so. I think there's a lot of synergies between, the work that NIA do in their reporting and what we can do from a more of a research perspective. But certainly, there's a lot more emphasis, and people are appreciating, particularly with everything that's going on at the moment, the value of nature and the value of being outside and looking after the environment and ensuring good water quality and aquatic habitat. And, because we all appreciate this. And biodiversity is becoming more onto the agenda now as well. Nationally, there's different programs being established. So I think there is a renewed emphasis on this importance. And I do feel, that this will continue and it will transcend whatever changes that may happen in terms of Brexit, etc. Because we still need to work through protecting our environment, and that is the cornerstone of everything in our society. Really, is the importance of environment and water quality and habitat for agriculture and for ourselves.
Very good. And Robert, I suppose similarly with yourself in terms of the real-time data you're collecting in Lough Neagh, I suppose there's a number of different locations, I suppose, on the coast as well, where we're doing real-time monitoring. I suppose that's going to be very important going forward in this sort of area.
Yes, absolutely. And it just so that we got into this technology in freshwater because of the marine sections of AFBI have been using it for years, it's a simple case of scaling down the instrumentation and the moorings to fit the freshwater environments. And when you start to look at Lough Neagh, it is effectively an inland sea. It's big, it can be very rough, and it needs some fairly robust kit. When I started my career, I remember working with continuous monitoring data loggers on the Dollaghan system back in the early 80s. And we had real problems with stability of sensors, oxygen. You had to visit them every 2 or 3 days and recalibrate. That's gone up to intervals of weeks or months for some of the sensors now. And some of the sensors require you to be there now every 2 weeks rather than every 2 or 3 days. So it is the future. And it's a difference between investment in capital investment in the environment and hands-on, having people, and it's increasingly the way forward. And the advantage of creating a publicly available website and interface where people can actually see what's going on, and ties in with Maria's comment of the interest in the environment. It makes it a very, very valuable resource, not just for us, but for the country as a whole.
Yeah, and I suppose linking back to the sustainable land use management strategy, that was one of the recommendations that we try to influence behavioural change by making this data available to people on a real-time basis. So it's a very good development going forward, I think. So, Richard, I just want to come back to you for a few moments. You mentioned there about the autumn migration and the need to change our management strategies in relation to the Dollaghan trout. Do you want to just expand on that? What sort of changes are required to achieve that?
Well, yeah, there's a few things, I suppose. The main consideration behind this is that the current fisheries legislation has protections written in for young migratory salmonids. Those protections include things like screening off abstraction intakes for mills, for hydroelectric power generation, for all these sorts of things. And potentially operators will have to be aware of their obligations to screen to prevent fish being entrained in these sorts of structures during the downstream migration period. Now, it's always been assumed that that is in the springtime because that is typically when Atlantic salmon go to sea. And it's also typically when young sea trout would have dropped down to the sea. But before we undertook this particular tagging work, we didn't really know conclusively when young lake migrating fish ran to their lake and when they moved downstream. It does seem that the autumn time is an important period for these young fish to make their way from the headwaters, from the nursery grounds, down into the lake. And with that in mind, at this time of year, I think that we're going to have to think more carefully about things like water abstraction at that time of year, whether it's screened, how those young fish might be protected on their downstream emigration. Other things that come to mind might be licenses to control predators. They tend to be issued whenever the young fish are on their downstream migration. Again, that is sort of biased around the springtime. And if we have these autumn movements of fish, we're going to have to think about how we best protect those. So I think there are discussions that will result from this research, and those discussions are going to have to take place to think how we better protect these young fish. But at least now we're starting to understand their patterns, we're starting to understand when they move, how they move, hopefully in the future why they move as well.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question come in here, and I think it's linking back to Maria's work, but it's probably best answered by Richard or Robert. And it links back to that increase in flow that Maria showed, the increase in drainage from these catchments that over the last number of years. And the question kind of relates to, well, what impact do you think this is going to have on the spawning and nursery habitats of salmon in the years to come? So I don't know which Robert or Richard wants to take that first.
Perhaps Richard for the salmon side.
Yeah, okay. I think increasing flows are an issue. We did some work a number of years ago to look at the impact of increased river flows by month against long-term survival of juvenile salmon in the river bush. One of the key characteristics that came out of that was that salmon spawn in gravel areas. The eggs are deposited in gravel and they develop over the winter time. If you have big floods, high intensity floods, you can potentially suffer a washout of those eggs from their gravel substratum. So large bankful floods or an increased frequency of large bankful floods may have a heightened risk of damaging the eggs within the gravel. The other thing that we found that was significant was that young salmon tend to emerge from the gravel in the springtime. So the young of year fry emerge in around sort of April, early May. We found that if you have a disproportionately big flood at that time of the year, it also can have an impact on the young fish, which are trying to find a territory and set up life for themselves in the riverbed. After a couple of months, the fish become a little bit more robust and more able to withstand big floods. But there do seem to be a couple of critical periods within the year where increased frequency of large flood events could have a detrimental impact to salmon stocks in particular.
Okay, listen, we're coming close to midday, so firstly, I apologize. We didn't answer any particular question that you posted. We will follow up on it after the presentations, and we'll email you directly on that. Robert, just before we finish up, I just want to, is there any closing remarks that you'd like to make at the end here?
Yes, and I would just like to thank my two co-presenters for expanding so well on the general overview, and for supplying the detail. And it's clear that while rivers and lakes and even the sea, which we see coming next week, are very different environments, the process by which human-sourced nutrient load enters those systems and has an impact has some very, very common themes in terms of fueling internal growth in those environments, in terms of implying an organic and oxygen load on those environments, and also in terms of how you might mediate it, and how might the need to maintain control of our nutrient impact on the environment goes all the way through that and all the way through those themes. And while the habitats might be different, they're responding to the same basic core set of chemical and biological processes. And nutrient control is of fundamental importance to managing our aquatic environment.
Okay, thank you for that, Robert. Just before we finish up, again, I'd like to thank everybody for attending this morning. I hope you found the presentations of use. And do, if there's anything in particular that tweaked your interest there, do follow up with us with an email if there's something you want more information on. Before I finish, I want to draw your attention to next week's and the final installment of the Soil to Sea webinar series. And the webinar is entitled Where the Land Meets the Sea, a holistic approach towards the sustainable management of marine environment and natural resources. It's on the 28th of October from 10:30 to 12 p.m. And the presenters will be Dr. Heather Moore, who will focus on the use of catchment models in the management of ecosystem services supplied by shellfish. Following on from that, Dr. Adam Meller will focus on the importance of environmental monitoring and the delivery of an ecosystem-based approach in the marine environment. And then finally, we'll have Dr. Matt Lundy, who will focus on new advances towards an ecosystem-based approach in fisheries management and the impact this is having on policy and related to sustainable management of fishery resources. So again, thank you to everybody for attending, and hope to see you all here next week. Bye now.